Blizzard, this isn't it. I 100% understand what you're going for. It is a noble goal. But I think you're accidentally ignoring the one thing that is more important than any design goal you have, and that thing is fun. These new Mythic Plus affixes are just not fun. With every other change in Dragonflight leading players into better experiences, more fun, less headaches, this philosophy is holding back what is clearly one of your favorite game modes from being absolutely beloved. So let's get into what Blizzard have done and why people are having a very large reaction. They announced the Season 2 Mythic Plus changes, and this is amidst the backdrop of very stark player feedback in Season 1 of this expansion for a number of reasons that I just don't have time to get into right now. We'll touch on them later. Here's the changes. Quaking, Volcanic, and Grievous have been removed from the game. And this makes sense. Volcanic forced extra movement. Quaking was the subject of ridicule for forcing people to spread, and Grievous was a healer mechanic that honestly wasn't that bad, but as a disc priest, I'm glad it's gone. Explosive also got changed. Fewer spawn, but with quite a bit more help, turning them into a group problem rather than just a healer problem. Now, that's probably going to cause a few issues. But anyway, these were removed and they have been replaced, but with affixes that sadly seem to prove that, at least initially with this design, Blizzard have missed the point entirely. They prove that Blizzard either doesn't understand or does not wish to act on or under-indexes the issue that I think most players have actually been talking about with Mythic Plus affixes, which is just that they're not fun, that they're a big serving of sludge applied atop a dungeon that otherwise would be better designed if they weren't there from a gameplay experience, albeit we need to talk about the weekly variation thing at some point today. Now, Grievous was removed just to be replaced with Afflicted, which is another healer mechanic. An NPC spawns with low health, a curse, a disease, and a poison. If you either dispel it or heal it, then yeah, that's fine. But if you don't help it within 10 seconds, it will reduce all players' haste humongously by 10 seconds, which is a pretty damn large punishment. But yes, solving the mechanic is easy enough. Just dispel, just throw a heal. Off-healers like paladins, druids, and shamans could even dispel or maybe even heal it if the healer is busy, and I'm sure Blizzard sees that as a nice little aside to this design. Incorporeal is new. An ad spawns for 20 seconds, it cannot be killed, but it's susceptible to all forms of crowd control. It has an 8-second cast that will drop damage and healing by 50% for 10 seconds, which is a really tough punishment, but it is an easy solve, I guess. Just throw like 3 interrupts at it, or maybe 2 like perfectly timed ones so that it despawns, maybe hit it with a paralyze and ignore it, because yes, it's immune to AoE, which means you don't need to worry about a CC break. And then we've got Entangling, which is the one that's pissed people off. I don't think it's pissed people off because it's hard. I think it's just pissed them off because it's annoying. So, you know those quests where you have to basically pull in a vine and you're super slow until you snap the vine? Well, imagine having to randomly do that in combat, but if you fail, you get a 3-second stun. And now you can see why people are pissed. You have 8 seconds to move 10 yards, which will be easy if you can disengage, blink, use freedom, or anything like that will outright solve it. And you may have also noticed something else that I've loaded all of these statements with, that all of these are very easy to deal with. But this is where we elaborate, because that is entirely in isolation. Just dispel for Afflicted is fine. Until you're in a situation when you actually need your dispel and full healing attention or someone dies. Maybe think of like the final boss of Jade Temple, which, yeah, isn't going to be in this season, but it's an example, right? So one of those situations, you're overloaded, and really it's the affix that kind of ruins things for you. Now, Blizzard may be like, well, yeah, that made it harder, but for a lot of people, that doesn't feel like they're playing the dungeon and they lost the dungeon. It feels like they're playing Mythic Plus and they lost the Mythic Plus thing coming in and ruining their dungeon. I think there's a lot of very interesting cognitive things with this and how these systems are framed to players. I'll put those aside for now. It's going to have the same issue that Quaking did, though, because around 98% of the time it will be fine, but the 2% of the time where it creates a nigh unsolvable problem, then players just got to ask, is this worth it? And obviously not even to speak about what this does to class selection, because, oh, it's Afflicted week? Well, Druid Shaman week. If you're playing a rogue, maybe log out and come back next week. I mean, who knows, their damage might still be incredible though. Same with Incorporeal. It's an easy solve, but it spawns randomly in the middle of a pack that requires you to interrupt a lot of dangerous spells. Like, imagine if that happens. You already taxed and interrupts because the dungeon you're doing actually has mechanics that a designer has tailor-made into the ad packs. Oh, and then suddenly this affix just pops up and does a new thing. And then you're like, okay, cool, we're just shit out of luck. Imagine that in a group that doesn't interrupt often. Oh boy. And maybe you're the one that's doing the heavy lifting and it just so happens to spawn. I mean, good luck in that case. And I bring that up because the Dragonflight dungeons are already so full of abilities that are very important to CC, right? You would then worry that this would over-leverage melees and classes with disrupts because it's just throwing more stuff onto the pile. And also, Blizzard, nameplate soup. This is more nameplates in a game that is massive nameplate soup, that for a lot of people it's just overwhelming and crazy. And especially in a case where, I mean, straight up everybody, if you're doing keys, get Plater. Just get Plater. It'll make things so much easier. And maybe some of the Blizzard designers are playing with Plater turned on. That does make a lot of these things a little bit easier to track. But like, Blizzard, if you're designing for WoW as you ship it, you've got to think about how readable your game is, because it's not by default. Entangling is the most obvious one that's going to cause issues. I think mostly just annoyances. I mean, a random slow that can come in at any time in a way is kind of insane and frustrating. It will cause deaths, probably quite a lot. I mean, imagine Entangled during the Halls of Infusion Gauntlet at the end. Do you remember the Halls of Infusion Gauntlet at the end? Well, that would be fun. And then there's funny ones, like take the Dragon and Vortex Pinnacle, where there are winds blowing, and you want to be upwind of the dragon, because like you'll do more damage or whatever. So if you're downwind by the dragon, not only while you're trying to go upwind are you moving slowly, but then if Entangling happens during that time, for those 10 yards, you're going to be moving like, I mean, who knows how those slows will stack, I suppose. Hopefully they won't just make that insane. So yeah, it's one of those things, like you can obviously use a massive amount of tools, like boosts, blinks, freedom, that kind of thing, which is fine, maybe that's when you save your stampeding roars for, but the random application of it means that you cannot rely on those things if you need them anyway, because the dungeon is designed by designers who are designing the dungeon around the gameplay toolkit of characters. It's kind of like the gameplay equivalent of a jump scare in a shitty horror movie, you know? You know it's coming, so you can't really relax or focus, and when it does happen, you're just pissed off because it's not good and it's cheap. So none of this stuff is truly abhorrent, right? That's one thing I do want to put out there. They have in fact thought about these a lot. It will take a small amount of player effort just to go, click, problem solved. There are enough asterisks baked in that a competent group will rarely have issues here. And on paper, making sacrifices in talents and in what globals you use to solve problems is, you know, good gameplay design. It is more decisions to make, the distribution of resources. But sometimes the issue is that it completely contends with what damn near everyone in the community has actually been saying that they sort of want from Mythic Plus with the experience. On the PTR forums from Solvenir, there's a good post that puts it like this. It feels like Blizzard's entire philosophy for making Mythic Plus interesting is to poke players with sharp sticks with varying intensity and frequency, and I simply have no desire to participate in a system designed to frustrate me. Now that's really interesting, because imagine if the poking with sharp sticks, imagine if that's just, the dungeon that you're playing and the intended mechanics. Then people are not going to blame that. They're just going to be playing the dungeon, and it will be, is this a fun dungeon with well-designed packs or not? But the way that then the Mythic Plus system randomly just, sprinkles in like randomly timed affixes and stuff, that is then what really disrupts that gameplay and makes it, as I think Solvenir put it, to a lot of players. I mean, Volcanic is never really a problem. It just does feel like, oh, screw you, God damn it, right, I'll move for Volcanic. Which I suppose can be annoying, if you're in the middle of like just actually trying to heal and playing the bit of the game that you're there to play, which maybe is like healing. And you just got the Volcanics just annoying you. And I know that there you can just be like, oh, well, get good. And no, I'm not saying it's a problem. I'm saying that it's a totally solvable problem that anybody can get around but maybe it's annoying and not fun and doesn't add to the experience. That's sort of the question. And I totally understand that these new affixes are supposed to add difficulty and, create a problem to solve and be more interesting than purely adding a few more %. And on that, mission accomplished, bag secured. But the thing is that difficulty is being added in ways that are basically do this or get fucked. I think the mission itself is flawed because it doesn't make the game more fun. It's just adding a little mini game on top that nobody really wants to play. Like, you know those times where a boss just throws a bunch of swirlies at you that have got they're just not tied into any other mechanic in the boss fight, and just like, Blizzard, why are you doing me with swirlies? These aren't interesting, they're just annoying. It's like that wrote large. Again, swirlies are easy to avoid. It's just that sometimes that shit's annoying. Things like, say, imagine having to complete an extra captcha before you can do your big cooldown. It's like, oh yeah, a little hoop I've got to jump through before I can do the thing I'm actually here for. If the dungeon had these mechanics baked in, you see, that would be fine, because that's the dungeon. But affixes are framed as an additional layer of go fuck yourself on top, which is where the frustration comes from. As an example, DPS Decurse being necessary on the last boss of Temple of the Jade Serpent for super high level keys was a bit annoying, and it did limit classes at those super high levels, but ultimately it wasn't that big of a deal. Because you're fighting the boss, it's a hard boss. Those dispels are important on that boss. Rip if you don't have mass dispel in your team comp, and you just find a strategy and go and do it. And that's fine. That's texture, that's flavor, that's the unique identity of that boss. But Blizzard just coming along and kicking you in the shins while you are busy trying to, say, play that final fight of Temple of the Jade Serpent, just trying to play the dungeon, that's the bit that just doesn't feel fun. So from a purely fundamental standpoint of making the game more fun for players, I think these fail even though they achieve the design goal, the bit of game design that in a way you could say is pretty damn good, because they are extra problems to solve that add some difficulty. And the difference between fun and the intended design, that's the problem. You can achieve your design goals and get a 10 out of 10 for my goals as written down on paper are achieved, but what if it's not good? And I'd say this to Blizzard, if you want to micro-iterate in these, just remember the good old phrase, it's not how hard you row, but it's what boat you're in. A lot of hard work honing a shit design, it's still going to be, it'll be shit, but defanged, rather than be fun. So you gotta change direction, rather than hone the thing that people don't like until they can accept it. Because then you're just sprinkling more and more sugar in the bitter pill. What's the fix then, everybody? Is it, what do we do? Do we add difficulty without actively interrupting gameplay? How do we do this? What's the thing? So ultimately, the issue is mechanical complexity here, not necessarily difficulty. Now, obviously, complexity is a part of difficulty, but even Blizzard should remember when they talked about classes being overly bloated. But, they would talk about classes being very bloated, but like complexity doesn't equal depth. And I think that is a situation where sometimes more problems to solve, it's not really like depth that people want. It's not really something that they'll appreciate. These affixes distract from what you're doing instead of changing up how you're doing what you're doing. So if we are going to take, right, and this is to start a conversation, let's take the base premise that Blizzard has, which is that affixes are not Kiss Curse at this level. They are purely a problem for you to solve, a way to add more difficulty. Let's spitball a few ideas that perhaps would have a more reasonable impact on the dungeon. So let's have one called Bulwark. And in Bulwark, a banner spawns in the middle of a pack. It reduces damage taken by 50 to 90% for mobs in that pack, and it needs to be single target focused down. AoE will hit it, but maybe it has a lot of avoidance, so AoE is inefficient. DPS will have to change up what they're doing for a few seconds to get rid of the banner, but that's it. If that's not hard enough, maybe Blizzard could give it a ramping damage buff to mobs while it's up. Now, what I would say here is, in my head, I see this, I'm like, oh, this doesn't necessarily seem fun, but hey, here's what it isn't though. In a way, it's not very disruptive. It's a target change and a slight distraction from AoE. But the key thing with that is that it would not threaten to completely delete you if you've not done it perfectly. Maybe it slows you down, and if your group totally ignores the mechanic, then it becomes a little bit more of a problem. But I think that's something you could maybe get to work a little bit more simply. Here's another idea. Let's just call it hot potato. One mob in a pack glows red and gets big. After taking X amount of damage from single target attacks, then the hot potato passes to another mob, so that the DPS tab over to hit that other mob instead, and after a few passes, the hot potato goes cold. If it isn't passed, it explodes, doing some damage and giving players significantly increased damage taken for a little while. Now, this would be a group-wide mechanic. It doesn't add anything overly complex. There are no, there are no fun ways of dealing with it, but it's the same thing of slowing you down and making the key harder as a result. But the difference is it doesn't flavor certain classes too hard, it doesn't mess with talent builds too hard, it doesn't overtax class utility too hard, and it doesn't take control away from your character. So this is the points that I guess me and Matt are trying to bring up here with the design, which is you can add the difficulty, but in ways that don't overly change up and muddy the player experience. Even though some of these, if they were announced, people might be like, oh, I mean, that's it, fine, whatever. It's harder, but at least my character won't be dazed or something. There's one more idea that is a little bit more out there, and it brings up a very important concept that I think we need to think about, and I think that Blizzard utterly needs to think about too. Because in a way, I've really just realized how Ian said something to me, but the actions of the team don't mesh with the logic that he justified the removal of seasonal affixes with. Now, have you ever played a game called Super Hexagon? It's a great game, Irish game designer, Irish musician, big thumbs up, Super Hexagon's awesome. So, imagine a mob got really big and glowed blue and started to pulse out rings with, gaps that are safe zones, like a slower version of that Brawlers Guild fight. And you can either reposition in the gap to avoid the damage, and, it would just be a minor reposition once at the start, or, maybe if you don't need a hard cast, you could just jump over the ring, right? Now, if that was happening randomly, it would be literal hell on earth. It would probably go down as being one of the worst affixes they've ever made because of how many wipes it would kill in inopportune moments. Just like whenever you were killing the worm dude in Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, and then the bit where you have to stack before they hotfixed it, quaking could drop, and you're like, great, quaking makes me want to go like this, the boss mechanic makes me want to go like this, so it could be terrible. But imagine it this way. What if you pick a few mobs in the dungeon? And you apply it to those mobs so that based on the geometry of the dungeon and everything, there's actually an intended design instead of it just being randomly applied. Because the point there is now it would feel more like an in-dungeon mechanic instead of a random game system suddenly slapping you with something with no rhyme or reason. It's not a perfect idea, but I think it's one that demonstrates that you can add another mechanic at a fixed level in the dungeon, actually have that really feel natural within the dungeon, and do that instead of randomly fiddling with players via an affix. And that actually might even feel like a fun new designed difficulty. You could add and change up gameplay in the way that a lot of popular seasonal affixes have done, where instead of being like Thundering, where it's just randomly, or not randomly like it is every 90 seconds of combat or whatever, but you know what I mean, where instead it's like, okay, that, and that mob are Dreadlords now. That's the change. Or what they did with Season 4 of BFA. So those are three very quick ideas, specifically not meant to be kiss curse and specifically meant to make the game harder. And yes, harder in a way that maybe will cause a bit of frustration, but not harder in a way that will mess up your plans for your character, be overly punishing for certain classes, or cause some of the loss of control issues, or maybe some of the random assholery that the current affixes do. Because look, if you come up to a mob pack and you see a banner or you see a hot potato mob, you know that when you're going into the pack, so it doesn't feel like you're being randomly fiddled with. Again, Blizz, please come on, I think these are all ideas that are, I mean, yes, they're variations on a few things that you've done before, but man, I think it would be a bit more work because you maybe have to go through and place some of these by hand, but by doing that, you can just save all your dungeons and you can cap the downsides that truly are what can make somebody have a few good Mythic Plus dungeons, 2 bad ones in a row, rage quit, and not want to engage with the system for ages. Our idea here is not a massive pain in the ass, but a bit more difficulty. Overall though, it's time for affixes to be looked at more closely, and even if they should exist. Like the removal of the seasonal affix, in a way that was praised because we expected a shift in the affix design with a rework, not them to double down because it all happened amidst the backdrop of player feedback. Looking across feedback in the forums right now, most people are actually praising the older seasonal affixes, which is fair, they were generally pretty damn good. They changed the dungeons up. Now, Blizzard is basically saying, well, we don't need that because we're doing all of these new regular affixes and we're changing up the dungeon pool. And if you think about those seasonal affixes, for the most part, they weren't random bullshittery being thrown at you. They were a change up in the design where you got to play with that extra bit of fun, more tailored, Kiss Curse difficulty, and that's why people liked it, because it wasn't, as your man said in the forums, being poked and prodded with random sticks that are differently pointy at different frequencies. And also, to what Ian said in his interview with me, I don't think you can argue that you want seasonal affixes gone because people don't play the dungeons in your pure form, and then literally refuse to let players play the dungeon in its pure form by adding a layer of just randomly dispensed bullshit on it it just doesn't work. So I'd say for one season, just one, maybe try to run with no affixes. Maybe just more aggressive scaling. Maybe try to go a little bit more all in on your seasonal affixes, right? Like you could perhaps do things there. I mean, we had that Dreadlord one at the end of Shadowlands. It was pretty cool, but maybe you could have it so that those Dreadlords could be doing slightly different things, different weeks. I mean, who knows? You could have it so that a seasonal affix is partially activated at 10, fully activated at 15. There's a lot of things that you could do. We even did an entire video on that stuff a while ago. And also for the point of positive affixes, at no point would I have said that a positive affix, and maybe this is something where I should have been more clear to Ian or whatever, but I would have never said that a positive affix is going to be purely like, just make the dungeon easier. No, it's got to be something, like, it's got to be Kiss Curse in nature, or even positive in the way of, like, yeah, a little void zone, and if you stand in it, you take a dot, but deal more DPS. Or maybe even take those boss fights where there is an area where you can do more damage, but it's a bit risky to go into. That's an idea of a positive affix that still, instead of saying move or you'll be screwed, it'll be saying move, and if you can get away with it, you'll do a bit more damage. Almost a little bit like with the design of Thundering. Yeah, so I think that at least this news story with the affixes, it is some taste validation for Blizzard, right? They can learn. And that's why I say, Blizzard, please rethink this. Please realize that while feedback may boil down from your perspective as a game designer as people want to play the easy game, not the hard game, think that maybe the issue here is that the way you make the game harder makes it less fun, not the difficulty. Because we know people are happy to play a hard game if it's fun. The biggest games on Earth right now are really fucking hard. Like, if you go out and play Valorant or CSGO or like high-end like MOBAs, they're hard. People are fine to play rock hard punishing games, but it's got to be fun. And there's one thing that I like about, and I know it's the most trite thing in the universe to bring up Dark Souls, but one of the reasons why Dark Souls went well and why it was able to, as an example, you have Horizon's Forbidden West that gets utterly BTFO'd by Elden Ring. Horizon's sitting there with all of its different difficulty settings and all of its things, and Elden Ring's just like, nah, the difficulty setting is like what weapon you choose, what build you choose. The thing that people liked from the difficulty of those Souls games. Because in a way, a Souls game compared to, say, what I see fighting game players pull off, what I see high-end StarCraft players play off, in a way you could almost say that those games, they do have a very big level of simplicity and ease, as in they're not uber mechanically hard games, but what they are is they are punishing. But they balance being punishing with being very simple and very clear, presenting the player with their own set of tools, the enemy set of tools, that's that. Imagine seasonal Elden Ring, where you basically add Diablo-like boss affixes onto characters. You can immediately see how something that was once nice, simple, worked, just turns into gobbledygook. Now, obviously, Blizzard are going to be thinking, well, the difference there is World of Warcraft, and one of the differences, it's a bloody different game. Also, you have, you have teammates, and all the stuff with like different builds, and then I say, yeah, a degree of that's fine, but as a game designer, you should put that in your dungeon design, not in your random bullshit. So I don't know. I think Blizzard they're continually taking the thing of good game design is a series of interesting decisions for the player to make. And it's like, yeah, but guess what? Your boy Sid Meier wasn't making Mythic Plus Dungeons. He was making the Civilization games, which are very different. So yes, interesting decisions is important. But how much do you index on that? How weighted are you towards, raw second-to-second game feel versus big interesting decisions? Because ultimately, a lot of games like Civ could probably be turned into a spreadsheet, and for those who could deal with a spreadsheet UI for Civ, they'd still have a blast because of the interesting decisions. But that ain't World of Warcraft. The balance is wrong, and I think they need to change some of their design defaults. I think it's a departure away from the philosophies that have made Dragonflight an excellent expansion. And I think there's a reason that M+ is so divided in the community right now, Anyway, that's all I've got to say for things today. It's frustrating to have Blizzard taking win over win over win over win, only to drop the ball turbo hard in this one. But this is the newer Blizzard. They are way better at taking feedback on board. Hopefully they either reduce how frustrating these are, or, in an ideal world, change their design direction. That is it for me. I would love it if you leave your comments down below to help us all understand what's going on. I'll see you next time.